Data, in turn, informs what policies you need to be implementing, helps us figure out where we're going next. It tells a story, and it helps us connect the dots. All right, and so as I mentioned, if you start with your GSP as your first kind of line of defense with figuring out policy, your projects and your management actions are essentially your commitments to detail how to mitigate overdraft, how to balance your sub-basin. It includes a variety of initiatives to both increase supply and reduce demand in your GSA. So those are kind of the two main avenues. Everybody's going to have to ultimately get more surface water into the ground, and in tandem, ultimately, everybody will also likely have to pump less. In most cases, it's a combination of both, especially in overdrafted basins. And so kind of just figuring out, what's being pumped out and what's coming in, and then data will help us do that. All right, and then management actions here are kind of just specific action items that you need to do to balance the overdraft, to close the data gaps, and to gather that information that helps you stay in compliance. So ultimately, data collection is driven by the management actions that you're implementing, right? Those management actions will inform what kind of data you need, and then we'll give you a roadmap for how to go about collecting that data. What information is useful to you? What information is essential to collect, based on your chosen strategies for reaching sustainability and keeping local control. And then the last bit that I wanted to touch on from our last session was this data picture, building your data picture. So I'm going to come back to this pyramid often throughout this series. We're trying to get to decision making, right? That's the purpose for data management in the first place. There's a lot of different reasons for it, but ultimately, data needs to be useful to us. It needs to have structure and purpose, and it needs to create a clear picture of what's going on in our management area, in our GSA, in our sub-basin, to pull together those trends, to identify those gaps, and to have that information facilitate decision-making for us to stay in compliance. So we're starting here with raw data collection at the bottom. I know, people kind of get hung up on like, okay, well, what data do I need? How do I store the data? Both of which are very important, but the meat of it is really the collection, right? So there's a couple principles that I wanted to point out here of data management generally and data collection as well. The first being frequency. So do we have enough data to tell us something that makes sense? Do we have enough data where we're starting to identify trends and patterns? So frequency of data is the first principle I wanted to point out here. All right, then the next one here is consistency. So are we comparing apples to apples? Is our data like enough, right? Comparing like enough things that, again, it feeds into telling a story, telling a data story. And then the final data principle that I wanted to point out here is quality. So is the data good? Is it defensible? Is it data that I can stand behind if the state board comes to me and says, hey, what's going on in your sub-basin? I can get behind it and say, this is my data. This is where it's coming from. This is how I know that it's good quality. This is how I know that it's accurate and telling me the truth, essentially. Right. Okay, so that was kind of recapping a little bit about what we talked about last time. Now we can kind of get into data collection strategies. So I did want to ask first. No, I didn't. I actually wanted to introduce them first. I was going to first ask you guys. All right, so we're going to kind of touch on 3 data collection strategies in this session. The first is manual data collection. So that's kind of the baseline. A lot of folks are already doing that. Then we're going to be talking about hybrid data collection. So yes, there's still manual entry involved, but we're digitizing these workflows in a way where we can start doing a level of manual entry in a digital interface that can feed into something else. And then finally, we're going to kind of talk about new tech and future tech. It's already happening in some cases, but it's still pretty new. So automated data collection. So streamlining that process and reducing that manual entry as much as possible. So now I wanted to ask if you guys don't mind being a little doing a little participation, audience participation with me, but I wanted to kind of check in and find out what are some critical pain points with data collection that you guys are facing. So I'll give it a minute or so. Oh, I don't know why it's not showing up. Okay. I'm just gonna
If
read them
they
out.
aren't showing up, if people want to type them into the chat, I can read them out too. If for some reason the Menti isn't working.
Yeah, sorry about that. I can also read them out loud. All right, so there's some good ones over here. There's humpers don't want to share data. There is the desire of landowners to participate fully and keep their data uploaded and clean. And then there's staff time. So those are some really good answers. And there's a bit of a trend there about how do we get buy-in from people who need to provide data. Yeah, does anybody want to elaborate more on that? Somebody saying the desire of landowners to participate fully and keep their data uploaded and clean. I think that's a really good point.
That was from me, Alexis Silvera with North Fork Kings GSA. We've had really great well registration. About 87% of our landowners are registered, but we keep going back to the fact that it's not a one and done type scenario. They need to go back in if they've bought property, if they've sold property, if they've added a new well or deconstructed one. All of that needs to be data that's uploaded and cleaned up, periodically. And so I think it's kind of a mindset with a lot of landowners. Like, I've done it, I filled it out, move on. And it's taken a lot of outreach work on our end to make sure that that data stays clean. So that's where I was going with that.
Yeah, that's a really, really good point. Um, Yeah, actually, that's a great point. Like what I was thinking of was kind of like data collection and like how do we start it? How do we make sure that it, is good quality and all of that? But that's a really good point of like data collection is not just a one-time thing, it's a regular thing and it needs to be reproducible. It needs to be able to be updated and changed and information needs to, otherwise it's static, right? And otherwise, by the time you need that data, it's outdated. So great point. I'm sorry that the Mentimeter didn't work. Oh, it
There
did.
it is.
There it is. I just have to click. All right, cool. Well, thank you for that insight. I appreciate it. All right, so let's kind of get into some more of the all right, so yeah. Um, So manual collection is what I wanted to start with. That's kind of the baseline. So what you're seeing on the right over here, folks are probably very familiar, hand filled out forms. This is probably actually a cleaner version of what usually comes in. There's only a bit of messy and difficult to read handwriting on this side. But for the most part, it looks pretty clean, right? There's check boxes and there's some level of data validation over there. But this is kind of what I think of when I think of data. There's a lot of clutter. Um, and people are used to collecting in this way, right? So people have file cabinets full of documents. I'm sure everybody has that, binders and file cabinets full of documents. And what that does is that data is very valuable, but it ends up sitting somewhere and we are not able to ask questions of it, right? At that point. So one of the things I wanted to note here is that, people do have a hard time moving away from this because it's familiar and people are used to it. And then we have a lot of historical data that's already been collected in this way, right? In the paper way, paper forms. Yeah, I did want to highlight a few kind of challenges that come through with manual collection, right? There's obviously benefits and there's some trade-offs there. Um, but a couple pain points I wanted to highlight. The first being data entry issues. So typically when somebody is sending out a paper form, somebody fills it out, sends it back in, there's multiple different entry points, right? So the let's say the landowner who's filling out the form is filling it out once, so that's one entry point. There can be human error at that stage of it. And then the staff who's inputting that data into a spreadsheet or into a database, that's another level of entry, or that's another level of data entry, right? So then there can be kind of errors over there as well. And it becomes more difficult when you think about the fact that there are inconsistent formats, right? So people have messy handwriting, people are writing different units, people are, maybe we're misreading numbers when we're doing the entry more than one time. The non-standard formats, it's very difficult to validate data that's being entered more than one time and on a paper. All right, and then process inefficiencies, which is kind of something that that was brought up on the Mentimeter as well. There's a ton of staff time that comes in with manual data collection. We're going out in the field, we're collecting data. Sometimes we're going and speaking to people in person and writing things down. Sometimes we're sending out forms, and then those forms come back into the office, and we have to manually sit there and type it all in. It's very time intensive, and it's costly, right? All right, then the third, you know, kind of challenge that I'm seeing here is data quality challenges. So there's a lack of validation, as I mentioned. There's no way to control for certain answers only being allowed, or control for people misreading the question and writing an answer that's incorrect. And what that leads to then is missed data points, right? That people might not fill out a section that's a mandatory section, right? There's no way to control for that if we're doing paper forms and a fully manual process. And then there's compliance and scalability. So when we have kind of what we're talking about, where there's paper forms in binders, paper forms in file cabinets, data that's in different places, what that means is that that data cannot connect to other data that's important. So we have data in silos, which creates this lack of coordination across the GSA, across the subbasin, and even just the data itself ends up being disconnected and uncoordinated, which makes it very difficult to ask questions of it and then get to decision making that we were talking about, right? There's a high risk of error that we're seeing. And that's really important for compliance purposes, right? You want to be able to, for compliance purposes, say that I know my data, I trust my data, I know that it's clean, I know that it's accurate, and I know that it can speak to other data in a way to help me figure out where to go next, help me make decisions, right? I can't see the screen properly, so are there any additional thoughts to bring in here? I really liked what Alexis was saying about the buy-in and making sure that we're able to update the collection. To me, that also comes into compliance and scalability, right? It's very difficult to scale data if we're having trouble collecting it at different points, right? Rather than just the one and done. So any thoughts here before I move on? Awesome. So that's kind of manual data collection, right? All right. So what I want to spend the majority of our time today talking about is hybrid data collection strategies. So what I mean by hybrid data collection is that we are digitizing manual workflows. So that means that there might still be some level of manual data entry, but we're doing it through a digital user interface where you're able to validate, you're able to remove some steps of the process, you're able to send it automatically into a database, you're able to kind of collect data at more than one point, make it happen, collect it more than once, and with some checks and balances, right? So this is kind of where most folks are moving. I know everybody has some level of manual collection. I think the natural next step is, hybridizing that, digitizing those manual workflows. So some of the things that it alleviates here is in a hybrid format, there's one single point of entry, right? So instead of having the landowner fill out a form and then sending it to the staff then fills it into the spreadsheet. Instead, it's, the landowner directly puts that into a digital user interface, or the staff puts that directly into the digital user interface. So that's reducing at least one point of entry, which does help with data accuracy and, reduces errors. There's less staff time, kind of for the same reasons, where you're not necessarily having to go and manually type every single paper sheet in. You're kind of streamlining that a little bit. There are ways to validate data, and I will walk through a case study of that so you can see what I'm talking about. But yeah, you can, make sure that the data is cleaner, eliminate some human error, make sure that there's only certain answers that you're able to put in. And then it is scalable, right? It enters a relational database, it connects to other data points, and for compliance purposes, that's really, really important. So I wanted to walk through a bit of a case study here. Well registration forms. A lot of folks are doing this manually, and I understand the reasons why. It's familiar. It's people have been doing manual collection for a very long time and might not know the reasons for trying to digitize that. So what you're seeing here is kind of the user interface that we use for well registration. So, walking through, you have parcels claimed already, and then you're able to register wells, right? So, kind of showing you already what those coordinates are, right? Otherwise, I might have to go and stand in the middle of the field, get my GPS out and see what the coordinates are of my well location. If I'm able to find that on a map already and kind of leverage some of that technology, some of those digital workflows, can already eliminate some steps there. All right, so for registering the well, what you're seeing right now probably looks similar to, what a manual paper form workflow would look like with a well registration form, right? It looks pretty familiar, looks pretty similar. It's a form with information about what data you need to provide, right? However, when we actually get into filling out the form in this hybrid way, where you're still doing data entry, but it's in a digital user interface, you can start incorporating things like drop downs, specific fields where there's only specific answers that you're able to give, right? So it's kind of eliminating that idea that, if a landowner is looking at a form, they're like, I don't know what my options are for these answers. There's very clear options there, right? And then this kind of gets into that data validation that we're talking about, right? Instead of getting forms back where people are skipping sections that are mandatory, skipping sections that, you want them to fill in for sure, it creates this validation thing of like, no, you need to fill this field out. Right. And then kind of what you're seeing over here is something similar, right? Again, with that validation thing. Somebody might not know, might accidentally mix up minimum depth versus maximum depth, right? They might switch them around in a paper form. And then that data comes to you and it's incorrect. In this case, you can apply rules in a digital user interface that you can't necessarily do when it's a paper form, when it's a manual workflow. And you can apply those rules so that landowners can see that, like, okay, actually, I almost did that wrong. I need to switch it around. And then this section kind of speaks to a bit of what Alexis was talking about here. There's still obviously the issue of buy-in, stakeholder engagement, and making sure that landowners are regularly updating information. But it allows for scalability. It allows for edits. It allows for you to change that without having to fill out an entire form all over again. Gives you some level of connection and communication to be able to update that entry, right? So if you can request removal, then that can go into a request, and then it's able to then connect to the workflow of the administrator, where they're able to see that, hey, somebody's requesting a removal. It's not a well. I accidentally put a well in, and that's not where the well is. And so I can, as an administrator, then hugely reduces staff time, where I don't need to, they don't need to call me and be like, hey, I want to redo the form because I did it wrong. All right, so yeah, just some of those things that we were talking about earlier with data quality is improved in a lot of ways. The process is streamlined a lot more, and we're able to validate that data a little better. Just been talking a lot. Any thoughts, any additions, any insights over here before we get into our next case study?
see any hands. The one thing to point out too that Tara is doing a good job of highlighting is another aspect of this that we're not talking about too much is when it's put into this digital format, it's going into a database. And it's going into now it's in a relational database that you can ask questions of. Because at the end of the day, really what you need is you need the data to be able to do something. Right. So when it's in a paper format, it's hard to congeal all that together and do any type of analysis or even just do something simple as, how many wells do I have? What types of wells are they? Are they domestic wells? What are they used for? If that stuff is in a relational database, which is where this is going, as opposed to even a spreadsheet. Spreadsheet, you can still, tally some stuff. You can run sums. You can do counts, but you can't relate it to another tab within that Excel sheet. Once they're in a table format in a database, you can start asking more questions. And it becomes much more powerful and useful to be able to answer the questions you're trying to get to the bottom of.
Right. Kind of going back to that decision-making principle that we're trying to get to, right? Data, if it's just lying there, not doing anything, it's not useful to you anymore. It kind of just is, it's like this stressful thing that you don't want to deal with because it's all messy and in different places and all of that. Awesome. Thanks, Rob. Anything else to add before we move on? All right. Okay. So next case study with kind of hybrid digital workflows is the ditch tender user interface. So Alexis from North Fork Kings is here with us. And I kind of was hoping that she might be able to introduce this a little better than I can. Just for some context, we work with North Fork Kings, GSA, and they asked us to develop a ditch tender user interface. So the context for that is that North Fork Kings are building out their allocation program. It's already built out, I believe. And we have been working with them to kind of figure out the water accounting, right? An allocation is highly dependent on the water accounting rules. So what water is coming in, what water is being pumped out, kind of the ins and outs of the water, the way you would think of with a bank account, right? And so in trying to ensure that we can see all of the surface water deliveries that are coming in for each landowner helps us determine the allocations, helps us determine what their water usage is looking like. And so North Fork Kings wanted to streamline that further rather than having the surface water entities send in a spreadsheet and upload that. We thought, hey, there's a way we can kind of put that manual entry into a digital user interface. So Alexis, I'll let you take that.
Thanks, Tara. So just to back up, North Fork Kings is in the King Sub-Basin. We have 168,000 acres, 135 of that is irrigated. But inside of North Fork Kings, we have 10 surface water entities, which makes this ditch tender user interface super important to us. So I just want to back up even further as to, you see the SWIG note on the diagram to the right, and that to us is surface water in the ground. So our sustainable yield is calculated by native sustainable yield and then surface water in the ground, which is why that ditch tender user interface is so important. So we came up with the ditch tender user interface when we were trying to figure out how to account for surface water in the ground in our accounting system and software that MLJ is building out. And then we tabled it for a moment and went back to manual entry, which is where we did a trial with one of our small water districts, and we used spreadsheets for manual upload. And we did that this irrigation season. And so while that went well, we still faced some challenges. And I think Tara has really highlighted in, without even knowing it, some of the challenges that we faced, one of which is scalability. We did it with a much more manageable surface water district. And when we started getting to think about the challenges and the issues we ran into on that small scale, we realized, how are we going to be able to apply this to our larger water districts? And really, there's there's no way to customize spreadsheets to the degree that we would need to on 10 different bases. So also, we ran into the accuracy and consistency. We found errors multiple times, and it wasn't because people, weren't good at their jobs. It's just natural. You hit a number or you miss a date wrong. And so then we also realized that you'll see in a diagram the turnouts. We needed to understand that turnout ID to parcel relationship in order to accurately account for SWIG. Because we have those mutuals, we just realized that like when you spread it across, when you spread your surface water in the ground across, we wanted to keep the surface water with the surface water users and not to spread it into wide areas. And so understanding that turnout ID to parcel relationship ensured a more reliable and precise SWIG. It also gives us centralized data management and long-term efficiencies. So the one thing that I think is really important with the ditch tender user interface is with somebody or a GSA like ourselves, where we have 10 different, surface water districts or mutuals. We can't just calculate a number and spread it across. We have to be able to also, everybody's at different levels of data management and data entry. And so we took upon ourselves to go ahead and create the ditch tender interface with MLJ. And so we'll be piloting that in the next irrigation season. So we're currently building it out right now and meeting with all of our surface water districts. But what was so exciting about the ditch tender interface to us is that it took what is currently a 7-step process into a 4-step process. And so, it makes it more efficient for the staff and then for the GSA as well. So we're really excited for it. And it should prove to be as efficient as we hope it is. Is there anything else you wanted me to touch on, Tara?
It was perfect. Thank you so much, Alexis. I guess maybe just like for my sake even, what does the ditch tender workflow, like data entry workflow, look like before digitizing it?
So with the spreadsheet, water's delivered, the ditch tender then records that turnout activity on a tracking sheet, and then the sheet would be submitted to the office. And then the office staff would re-enter that data into our spreadsheet. So they have their spreadsheet, then our spreadsheet, then their paper spreadsheets. And then it was sent to the GSA, where then I uploaded it, looked at all the data, uploaded it to Watermark, and then MLJ staff looked it over and made sure that the data was correct. That's where we found some of the issues. And then it eventually gets approved and uploaded to our dashboard. And then the landowner can see all of the surface water deliveries. And if they have multiple entities, or if they have multiple districts delivering with them, they can separate those out. They can see their total water deliveries. And then that then gives them their surface water in the ground credit. So what we're hoping it turns into, and what it likely will, is the water will be delivered, and then the ditch tender will have a device, whether it's a phone or a tablet, and they'll go and record the turnout activity on the device, and then it'll go into, I don't know the official term, maybe Tara, you can jump in here, but a staging site where that data will be held, and the surface water entity will be able to have admin logins to that staging site where they will be able to review and approve the data. If you can hear the jets over me, I apologize. We are right by the Lemoore Naval Air Station. And then the data is, once it's approved by the surface water entity, it is then uploaded into Watermark. So to us, that was just we went from literally a 7-step process to a 4-step process with one-time entry. The thing that I told, this went through our TAC committee, our technical advisory committee, and then to the board. And when we were talking about this, we really wanted to iterate that, the power still is in the surface water entity's hands. The data cannot be uploaded without their approval. So we're hopefully giving them the ability on that staging side to also then download the spreadsheet for themselves, creating less of a workflow for them as well. So yeah, I think ultimately it benefits everybody.
Right. Yeah, and it sounds like, basically it's reducing exactly what you said, reducing that time for everybody, right? Instead of like, multiple people typing into a spreadsheet and checking the data multiple times. It's entered once and validated, right? Because there's there's ways to, like ensure that these numbers are what you need them to be, right? And the units are correct and all of that, right? So it's validated that first time, entered once, and then they still have the eyes on it, right? You still have people who are able to kind of look at that data and edit as needed and then use it, right?
And for us, the SWIG number, one of the pieces of the SWIG is return flow. And return flow is derived from irrigation efficiency. And so this is where that turnout ID to parcel relationship is super important to North Fort Kings GSA because, the irrigation efficiency is crop specific. And so to have an accurate return flow estimate, we have to know what the crop is on the parcel. Which is another great feature that I don't know if we've built into Watermark with MLJ. So when the crop identity is unknown, then the GSA has to have, conservative defaults or wide assumptions across the GSA. And, we want things to be as accurate as possible. Another analogy I've used, and you can kind of see it in the diagram that Tara has up on the screen, is that let's say that farmer A has two parcels and parcel one is almonds and then parcel two is a recharge pond. Well, with the ditch tender interface, we can eliminate a step in the reporting process because we're able to know what's going into the recharge pond and what's going in to be irrigated for the pistachios or almonds or whatever I just said. And then that takes apart because we also have a custom built in for recharge reporting. So all of it ideally is made to fit into one another, right? Like it's just we're building out a very streamlined process because we do have 10 different surface water entities and we have to customize different features for each one. And it allows us to have one accounting tool with customizations built in throughout.
Yeah, and it's kind of like building out those different pieces of the relational database so that by the end you have a really accurate and you have audit trails, right? You know where that data is coming from, and at each stage it's entered once. You're not saying, "Did you enter like this? Did I enter?" And I think like tying it back to the Sigma use cases for that. You guys are doing allocations and allocation credits requires pretty meticulous like calculations and making sure that that data is accurate, making sure that those calculations have a solid basis, right? They're defensible numbers. And so in order to do that, it's really helpful to have all the different pieces in one place, right? I think that's what's really crucial. Does anybody have questions for Alexa? Oh yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think Rob said to me a few weeks ago, ultimately, that water is money and we need to account for water as if we were accounting our money. And these customizations in the data that we're able to, parse out and make more accurate is only enhancing the viability of landowners' operations for the long term.
Yeah. And it comes down to the collection. So, yeah, do you guys have questions for Alexis? I have a lot of questions, but I'll ask you another time. Because I know that, you've been working really hard on it and it's your baby, so it's great. All right, cool. Thanks, Alexis. That was super informative. All right, so we can definitely do like more examples of, hybrid data collection workflows. There's so many examples of that because I really feel like that's kind of where people are moving into. But I did, with our remaining time, want to kind of touch on kind of a newer type of data collection strategy, which would be automated collection. So Rob, I didn't know if you want to kind of touch on that. I kind of just put in a use case of pumping data and self-reporting versus telemetry, but go ahead.
Yeah, so there's a couple different ways to approach automated and what we mean by that. I think a very easy way to it might hit home a little bit more is telemetry data. So let's say you have pumps or meters that are located out in the field, and you want that data brought in. Whether those are coming from, they're connected by cell service or Wi-Fi or whatever it may be. We can connect, as an example, to those meters, and we can bring in pumping information. So that's groundwater pumping data from I think NetFM is actually on the call. So if they were providing telemetry data to a platform or an API service, we would be able to connect to that and draw that information in. So as opposed to somebody writing down on a piece of paper or even looking at the meter themselves in the field and putting it into an iPad, that's still kind of that hybrid approach. This is much more automated where it's automatically being drawn into a form or some sort of online space, such as Tara is showing here on the screen. You'll see like the October, November, December. So this could be the extraction volume. So on a month by month basis, this would be being populated from one of those metering services. So it's dumping it into the end user's space for them to review and to check for accuracy and then to just submit. So then we're taking it from the field. It's going into the digital space on its own. There's some human interaction of it being verified, and it's pushed into the database. So that's a very automated process. We're removing some of that manual entry, even removing some of that hybrid approach that we were talking about. So that's one that's like a good example of what we mean by automated. Then the next example is going a step further, and we're going to use the buzzword of AI. So artificial intelligence now is being brought into the equation. This one is automated. It does have like a little bit of a hybrid approach tacked onto it just because we start introducing AI, we want to make sure it's being used correctly. We also do want to have just a little bit of a human interaction to make sure it's verified and it's approved and it's doing what we want it to do. So the example that we have on the screen is in the irrigated lands regulatory program side of our company, or even just a state regulation that's out there that there might probably be people that are aware of. They have to report on their nitrogen use or their whole farm evaluation. So irrigation practices, pesticide application, and how that happens on the farm. So there's a paper that is sent out that is filled out. So it has check boxes. It has an ability for you to enter in some handwritten responses, and then you sign off of it and you send it in. Okay, that's a very non-automated process, right? But it's one that's hard to move away from because these forms change. Questions sometimes change year to year the way that we answer them, and there was a process in place of how this collection process started. We can change that over time, but in the meantime, we said, well, what if we wanted to let them keep doing this, or we already have collected it this way? Is there a way that we can automate this? And I'd say probably about 11 years ago, OCR technology was okay. And what I mean by that is optical recognition software. So it's a computer being able to look at the paper at certain things that you pointed towards and report that information back. So what we did is we took the newer versions of this. So OpenAI and Claude is the other two types of artificial intelligence that we employed. And we said, okay, we have two models and we train them on what these paper products look like that come into our business. We said, we want you to look for these certain things. And so what you're seeing on the screen is we created this user interface where it reads the paper product. And on the other side of the screen, it shows you what the responses are that it gleaned from it. And then it takes this another step and it says, okay, we have two different models. It compares them to each other. So OpenAI and Claude do this separately, and then they compare the responses to one another to see what sort of accuracy we're receiving back. If it's 100% accurate, it says that there shouldn't be any issue here, and then it provides it and dumps it into another screen for a person, someone on staff or whoever you might want to be in charge of this can look and say, okay, those answers across the board, they look correct. I can just push submit and they all go into the database on their own. So we're removing having to go in and read these one by one. You don't have to search them and make sure that answers are correct or check boxes are marked. A lot of staff time is drastically reduced when you can implement something like this. So this is an automated process. We're using artificial intelligence with a little bit of human action still in there. And Tara is showing you how that we've been able to kind of split some of these screens out where it's showing you on the top. That is what the AI models are returning, and then we're verifying it against the actual paper product on the bottom of the screen. So this is actually a live representation of what we're able to do. When we created like a nice user interface for you to be able to take this paper product on the bottom and compare it to the answers that the AI model is able to retrieve from that paper product.
Right. And just to chime in here, like this is a really good way to leverage your existing data, right? Because as I mentioned, and I'm sure as you guys all know, everybody has those paper forms or, stacks of papers or cabinet fulls, file cabinets, binders, whatever, of paper forms and historical data, right? Which at this point, it's so much effort to go through and to sort and to put into a database that sometimes it's not even used. And so this is kind of a really good way to leverage existing data if you have it without having to take so much staff time to do it, right? Everybody's too busy to kind of go through and sort through all of their data. But this is kind of a way where the main step that you would have to do is to scan it all in, right? To just put it on the scanner and scan it all in. Then the AI does the bulk of the work, and then the human goes in and just validates, right? So there's the QA/QC of like, I don't have to go in and like check these boxes, but I can cross-reference and see if it's accurate and then make corrections, right? So rather than entering it, you're just making the corrections. And so a Sigma use case that I'm thinking of right now is well completion reports. A lot of folks have like historical well data. You want to be able to use that data, but you don't want to have to go through hundreds of forms and cross-reference it physically on the map and see if it's still there. So yeah, that was
And another
really
way to kind of
interesting.
hit this home is, and I don't know if you might cut out for a second, Tara, but is if you have leveraging existing data, like if you have existing well completion reports, a lot of times those are in paper products. This would be a great way to integrate this. You can create all those stacks of paper, bring them into something in PDFs into a file folder, and then you can have the AI go in and read through that file folder and push that information into a database for you. It's a
Yeah.
very similar process that you could implement that way.
Any
Yeah.
thoughts on automated collection strategies? I know this is a kind of a new one, and as I mentioned, like the what I'm seeing is that manual exists everywhere. Hybrid, I think, is kind of the natural next step that people are taking, right? Kind of digitizing some of it, keeping some manual and keeping some digitized workflow, and then automated is kind of the big topic for like what's going to be happening in the future. So, yeah, any thoughts or insights or questions are welcome. Awesome. And Netafim folks, if you want to chime in about telemetry, feel free. If not, I'm just gonna move on to just the last bit of what we're talking about here. I kind of just wanted to tie it all back. We kind of talked about making sure that these data principles are there, right? And collection really does affect how well we can adhere to these principles, right? Collection affects what the quality of our data is going to look like, how accurate it is, how defensible it is. It will affect the consistency of our data, and making sure that there's validation there. And it will also affect the frequency. And that was kind of what Alexis was talking about, making sure that there's enough data and also making sure that that data is able to be iterated upon regularly, right? And I kind of wanted to leave folks with a question here, as well of like, how do we ensure that the data is connected and relational? So, I think we all touched on it briefly in today's conversation about like, we have all this data, we're collecting all this data. And, we can automate it, we can make it hybrid, we can do it manually, but how do we then put it into a system that will allow us to ask questions of it, make sure that that data is useful, and, make sure it's connected to other data so that we can build that, that picture of of what our basin is looking like. And so that really comes down to storage, which is what we're going to be touching on in our next session, talking through how do we connect data? How do we make sure that it's something that we can ask questions of, kind of like what Rob was touching on. Anything to add there, Rob?
I don't think so. I think you pretty much covered everything.
Okay. Okay, now I'm going to leave a little bit of a longer, I know we've been talking a lot. I'm going to leave a little bit of a longer time for questions. I know that, it takes a second to gather your thoughts, but yeah, anything, thank you. Yeah, totally fine. Yeah, anything to add or any insights here?
Going back to the telemetry side, I mean, I think it's definitely a good solution right now. I know we've been in talks. We're currently testing on a couple growers. It's going well. We're trying to validate a lot of the things, but some of the biggest feedback we've got was like from one of the growers. He's like, it's not like when it's right there. He was like, you know, I don't have to do any paper tracking. I don't have to do any of that. And he likes the fact that he owns the data. I think I think if it ever goes to the point where the government's like the California government is ever wanting the data, then they'll start to get a little nervous. But I think if you communicate it clearly that, hey, you own the data, you get to decide what you do with the data, they're very for it just because, I mean, irrigators forget all the time to write something down or, they have a million other things going on. So if you just have the automation there, I mean, I think it's a huge advantage.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that that kind of goes back to what Alexis was saying, where if you start to kind of update some of these processes, it's useful for more than one person, right? So in the ditch tender UI case, it's useful for the surface water providers to have that automated. It's also useful for the GSA. It's also useful for the landowner. And in your case, you're saying that like the telemetry data, yeah, it's definitely going to be useful to the GSA, but it's also going to be useful to the landowner to not have to go out and read those meters regularly and write it down. That data will just come to them automatically and they can use it for their decision-making purposes and their farming strategies.
Yep, absolutely.
Are there any folks, just out of curiosity, are there any folks who are kind of starting to think about at least hybrid workflows, kind of moving beyond manual? Are there management actions related to Sigma that folks are kind of moving into that digital space where you're leveraging that combo?
I think we only have a couple minutes left too. So the other thing we can point out is this is recorded and we will be posting it on our website. If anybody wants to review or send it out or give it to someone else to look at, it will be available to everybody.
Right. Awesome. Okay. And then our next session will be on storing and managing data. I think that's really a huge part of data management is like, where do you keep it? Do you keep it in a spreadsheet? Do you keep it in a database? Do you keep it in a platform? All of that, and kind of talking through those different strategies and options as well. I'm always available and open to talk data management and Sigma. So feel free to reach out. But other than that, thank you guys so much for being here and yeah, I'll send out a follow-up email with the link to the recording as well.
Yeah, thanks everyone for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
How do we stop recording? I got it. Stop recording and stop transcription.